Welcome to Permission to Thrive. I'm your host, Suzi Lula. As a spiritual therapist for over 20 years, I have the honor and privilege of ushering women and mothers just like you on a journey from simply surviving to powerfully thriving. I also have the honor of raising our son, Will, who is now a young adult, with my longtime partner, Jamie, so I'm right there on the journey with you. Consider this your personal sanctuary, your space to meet your heart, embrace your messy, and come home to your most authentic, extraordinary self. My hope is that you leave resourced and inspired because you are here to shine. Welcome to Permission to Thrive. Welcome, everyone. This episode is called Detox Your Life, a Guide to Setting Effective Boundaries. And if there is one area that I receive questions about daily from clients, especially women, it is about how to set effective boundaries. So I wanted to provide you a guide to setting boundaries. And in this episode, I cover why setting boundaries is so challenging, becoming aware of your boundary setting style, how to handle your fear of the other person's reactions when you do set a boundary, and how to create cooperation and connection rather than conflict around setting effective boundaries. So sit back. This is your sanctuary, your sacred time. Relax and enjoy. Welcome, everyone. If there is one area that I get questions about daily from clients, from other women, students, it is about setting effective boundaries. So I wanted to dive in today and provide you with a guide for setting effective boundaries. So before we jump in, let's all take a moment and get centered so that we can become as receptive as possible for this episode around boundaries. If it feels right to you, let's just gently close our eyes. You can place your hand on your heart, assuming that you're not driving, and just become still. We're all busy. You've just come from some activity. You're going to be going to another activity, but this time is your time. This is a time to connect with your wisdom, with your inner knowing, with your inner personal space, with your inner empowerment, so that you can learn to effectively stand in and embody your own personal space, your own connection to your most authentic self, and create the boundaries and the lifestyles that allow you to thrive. So whenever you're ready, gently open your eyes. You may have an intention around setting boundaries in your life. And if you do, just allow that to come forward right now. Perhaps you have been challenged in setting effective boundaries. So if there is an intention that you have around boundaries, relationships in your life, just call that forward now. And as we dive in, I want to start with why the heck is setting boundaries so challenging, especially for women? So it's really important to become clear on what you were taught about boundaries. Most of us were taught, especially women, be nice, be polite. Don't even consider setting boundaries in the first place. Most of us were taught, say yes when you really mean no. Can anybody relate? I can tell you that was a huge one for me. Between being nice, being polite, not even setting boundaries, not even considering my own needs, certainly I learned to say yes when I really meant no. Can you relate to most of us were taught to take care of everyone else first? Put everyone else first before you even consider your own needs. Put everyone else first before you even consider what boundaries you would create if you even had the permission to create boundaries in the first place. And lastly, can any of you relate to this one? Avoid conflict at all costs. Care more about the reaction of the other person than you care about your own needs. So most of us were not even taught, A, that it's okay to set boundaries, B, that boundaries are imperative when we want to live a thriving, rich, fulfilling life. And when we do give ourselves permission, how to create effective boundaries. We are not going to be able to create effective boundaries when we are still under the cultural message that says, put everyone first, care about the other person's reaction, don't create conflict, be nice, be polite. When we are under the cultural messages that we have been taught, we become inwardly conflicted to the degree that we are still currently caught in what we have been taught about setting boundaries. We will create an inner conflict because we have been taught these cultural messages, don't even set a boundary. But inside of us, we have a wisdom, we have clarity, we do have our own needs. We know intuitively, our wisest self, our highest self knows it is imperative to create effective boundaries so that we can create healthy relationships, thriving relationships, real connection, true intimacy in our lives. And so we create an inner conflict. Oh, I'm still so aware of the things I have been taught that tell me not to create boundaries. And yet I have an intuition that tells me when I am on a path of personal growth, that tells me I am seeking thriving relationships and fulfilling intimate connections with others. I know that it's imperative to have my own personal space and boundaries and empowerments. And so when we have an inner conflict, we are not going to have a smooth outer road and flow to creating these boundaries. If we are inwardly conflicted, we are going to create conflict on the outside with the other person when setting boundaries. Why? Because they read our energy, not our words. So when our energy is conflicted, our boundary setting will be conflicted. So first and foremost, we want to get clear on what we have been taught and what messages are still operating within us that are going to cause that inner conflict, that are going to cause us to say one thing, but the other person reads our energy. And so we want to become aware of what we've been taught so we can come into an inner alignment, an inner neutrality, an inner equanimity, and most of all, the inner permission that says, regardless of what we have been taught, it is imperative that we learn how to create effective boundaries so that we can create true, healthy, thriving relationships in our life. So far, so good. Just begin to become aware of what messages you were taught. Some of the questions that you can ask yourself are, what was I taught about boundaries? How did my family of origin react, respond, set, not set boundaries? How were boundaries handled in my own family of origin? What is still unhealed within me around boundaries? What is still confusing within me about boundary setting? You can also ask yourself, what do I still believe as of today around boundary setting? And lastly, you can ask yourself, what am I bringing into my boundary setting today? So that if I think about, for instance, me setting a boundary with Will or me setting a boundary with Jamie, I begin to become self-aware. What am I bringing into that boundary setting process? Am I nervous about creating conflict? Am I nervous about Jamie getting upset with me back? Then I can become aware, oh, I might be saying to him, oh, Lovey, I need an hour to myself. But if I'm nervous about him getting upset, he's going to read my energy. So you want to begin to ask yourself, what is the energy underneath the words when I am setting boundaries? What is the energy that the other person is reading underneath the words when I am setting a boundary? It's then very important to become aware of your boundary setting style. We have all been taught and we have all created these styles of setting boundaries. So I'm going to give you some examples of some of the boundary setting styles. Might you be setting passive aggressive boundaries? Might you be setting boundaries that are actually full of resentment? Might you be setting boundaries that are really very protected and armored up? You're armored up before you even set a boundary. You're so far from neutrality, equanimity, when you even set a boundary. And lastly, might you just be too nice? Might you be, rather than actually setting a boundary, might you be asking permission to even have a boundary from the other person? I know that I have experienced that so often in my life. I'm seeking to set a boundary, but really, if you study my energy, you will hear that I'm actually asking you for permission for me to set a boundary. So I'm going to say these again, and I want you to just be asking yourself, do any of these or do all of these resonate? Might you be setting boundaries full of passive aggressive energy, where you say the words, I need some time to myself, but it's full of complaint. It's full of resentment. It's full of, I'm so upset that I have not had this hour to myself, that even though I'm saying I need an hour to myself, it's landing upon the other person full of passive aggressive resentments and lots of judgment and lots of past messages, a lot of unspoken energy that is the farthest from a clear, neutral boundary of simply saying, I could really use an hour to myself right now. Might you already be armored up and protected, just waiting for that person to defend themselves, just waiting for that anger or that upset or their own reactions to come back at you. So you have an armor so thick that, again, when you say the words, what the other person is receiving is really your anger, your frustration, your judgments. So they're not even hearing the words of your boundary. They are feeling the energy that is coming with your boundary. And then lastly, as I said, I have done this so much. Oh, I could really use an hour to myself. I'm saying it as a boundary, but really, I'm asking your permission. Really, what I want is for you from the outside to externally give me the inner permission to take the time to myself that I really want, but I haven't been able to give myself the permission to stand in that. So there is a saying that I just love where boundary setting is concerned. So you ready for this? It's the tone that makes the music. It's the tone that makes the music. So just imagine yourself setting this boundary. I really need an hour to myself. I really need some alone time this afternoon. Imagine it is the tone that makes the music. Most of us set boundaries using very angry, protected, frustrated, resentful energy. Why? Because we wait so long to set the boundary in the first place. We have been taught that we are not allowed to even set a boundary. And so we get an inner prompting. I could really use some alone time. And we ourselves, rather than setting the boundary and taking care of ourselves, we ourselves railroad over that inner prompting. So we have an inner prompting. It says, I could really use some alone time. And we railroad over it. Oh, I don't really need that alone time. Oh, I'm not really allowed to ask for that, to set that boundary. Or let's say you are a parent and you really know inside of yourself 30 minutes is more than enough time for your child to be on technology. You have the inner prompting to set that boundary, but you are afraid of your child's reaction. So you railroad over that prompting that says to set a boundary about time on technology until you are so upset that when you set the boundary, it's full of resentment and anger and frustration. It's the tone that makes the music. So 3 different people can set a boundary. Oh, it's time to put your iPad down. I said it's time to put your iPad down. It's time to put your iPad down. 3 different people can say the same words, the same phrase, the same boundary, and the tone will make the music. It will be received dependent upon the tone. So we rarely set boundaries from a place of neutrality, wisdom, and equanimity. So I want to implore you during this episode, begin to become aware of the tone of your music. Is it dissonant? If the tone of your music is dissonant, you're not ready to set the boundary yet. You have to do the inner work so that when you commit to setting the boundary, you commit to setting a boundary that is full of equanimity. Because an effective boundary is a boundary set with equanimity. And if you are not going to set an effective boundary, if it's coming from anger, resentment, frustration, asking for permission, asking for validation, fear of the other person's reaction, you might as well just save yourself the time of setting the boundary in the first place. First, do the inner work to create your own inner equanimity so that when you do choose to set the boundary, you are bringing the tone of the music of equanimity. You are bringing a boundary that you are in alignment with, that matches your values, that matches your wisdom, that matches your inner prompting. And so you feel good about the boundary that you're setting. When I say I need an hour to myself this afternoon, when I let my son know that it's time for him to put the iPad down, I come to it feeling good about my boundary, or I don't come yet. Do you understand? So if you're not feeling good about the boundary you're setting, then you're still in the stage of needing to do the inner work to get to the good feeling. Because when we are following a prompting and our own inner wisdom, it actually feels good. When I know that it's time for my son to move on to the next activity, I want to bring that boundary feeling good about that. I'm doing a service for him. I'm doing a service for myself. When I know that I need an hour to myself, it's of service, high service to myself to stand in that boundary. So most of us set boundaries from a built up place of resentment or consistent self-abandonment. There is nothing like consistent self-abandonment. We have consistently abandoned ourselves for so long. We've consistently abandoned our needs for so long that we're literally angry at ourselves for not honoring our own boundaries. And then that comes across to the other person filled with that energy of anger, resentment, and our own self-abandonment, right? So if you come to your boundary setting with protective energy, if you're armored up, if you come afraid of the other person's reactions, if you're afraid of conflict, afraid of their anger, first thing to do is to sit with that internally before you bring that to the other person. Clear? If you are seeking to set a boundary around technology, to set a boundary around homework, to set a boundary around curfews or bedtimes, set a boundary around your own personal space, best clear your own inner energy before you even try to set the boundary. Because when you do, then you will set the boundary that is effective. Okay, excellent. Now, the most important part about setting boundaries is to learn to allow the other person to have their feelings. So think about it. No one really teaches this part about boundaries, and this is so important. This could be something you haven't really heard articulated this way before. Think about it. By the time you are needing to set a boundary, whether it's time to get off of your iPad, time to do your homework, time to brush your teeth, your curfew is 10 p.m., by the time you're needing to set a boundary in the first place, chances are the other individual is going to have feelings about your boundary, or you wouldn't be having to set the boundary in the first place. So I'm going to say that again. By the time you're needing to set a boundary, if you think about it, if the person wasn't already going to have feelings about it, you probably wouldn't be needing to set the boundary in the first place. If your child always came in at 10 p.m. and that was their curfew, you probably weren't going to have to set a boundary around it anyway. If your child is pretty compliant about your agreements around media, you're probably not going to have to set a boundary about it. If your partner has shared values with you about how to spend your money or save your money, you're probably not going to have to set boundaries about it. So often we need to set boundaries in the first place because the other individual is going to have their own feelings, their own agenda, their own attachments, their own hurts, their own wounds, their own value system around the boundary in the first place. So if you're having to set a boundary with your child, with your partner, just become aware, oh, they probably will have their own feelings, and every one of us deserves the space and the right to our own feelings. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. If another individual sets a boundary with me, then I might have my own feelings about their boundary. So when you can set a boundary with the understanding, set a boundary and have the understanding that the other person might have feelings about it, and feelings come and go, feelings pass. When you can become okay that the other person might have their own reactions to your boundary, you will stand squarely in your own empowered stance around setting your boundary. When you can allow your child their upset, when you can allow your partner their upset, your boss, your coworker, your girlfriend, their feelings, when that is easily allowed within your consciousness, you will be in a liberated position to set your boundary, because there's nothing that can't come to you, because there's nothing that you're afraid of. And now I would say, lastly and equally importantly, the whole point of setting a boundary is ultimately to create cooperation and to create connection. We often think of setting a boundary as something that separates us. It's like a line in the sand. It's like a boundary with a country. It's like, here's where your space ends and my space begins. So it becomes something that separates us. I really like to think of boundary setting as something that invites intimacy. So think about it. We typically use boundary setting as a way to basically complain, to passive aggressively complain to the other individual. We typically set boundaries from a place of anger, passive aggressive energy, and therefore when we set a boundary, we typically end up separating ourselves from the other individual. For me, I'm very, very, very committed to thinking about boundary setting as something that at the end of the day, I want it to bring me closer to the other individual. If I set a boundary with my son around a curfew, ultimately what I'm looking for is common ground. If I set a boundary with my husband, my spouse, around finance, around money, ultimately what I'm seeking is common ground, cooperation, deeper intimacy, deeper trust. So think about that before you set your next boundary. Are you using boundary setting as an excuse to complain, as an excuse to be angry, as an excuse to express your frustration? Or are you seeking deeper connection, deeper intimacy, more cooperation? So when you are setting a boundary, if your intention is clear inside of you, you are ready to set that boundary when you are neutral. You are ready to set that boundary when you are truly seeking cooperation. You are ready to set that boundary when you are seeking deeper intimacy, cooperation, connection. Until then, just do your inner work to get you there. Best not even to set a boundary until you really want cooperation and connection. Because when you are ready for connection and cooperation, I'm going to give you some questions to ask yourself that you will then manifest it in your life, and you will feel so good. You will be giving yourself such a good experience around setting boundaries. So when you are ready, ask yourself these questions. These are questions that will engender cooperation. They will engender conversations around cooperation, around connection, and they will help your boundary setting become very effective. So you can ask questions like, how can we work this out for both of us? How can we work this out for all of us? So for instance, I set a boundary. I say I need some time to myself this afternoon, and my kids are pulling on me and they don't want to comply with the boundary that I need some time. So then I would say to them, how can we work this out for both of us? How can we work this out for all of us? And then what ideas can you think of? And you allow every person to give their ideas, to give their input, even if they seem silly, even if they seem like something that is going to be impossible to do. You give the other person a space to share their ideas, to share their upset, to share their reactivity. You give them a space to allow their feelings to pass, because underneath, for all of us, your children, your spouse, another individual, we all want to be connected. We all want to cooperate underneath it all. So you ask, how can we make this work for both of us? How can we make this work for all of us? What ideas do you have? What can you think of? And you allow the other person the space to let them have their feelings. Their feelings will pass. This teaches the value of contribution. It teaches the value of everyone being heard and seen. If you set the boundary that says it's time to get off of your iPad and your child comes back with lots of big feelings, you say, okay, of course, it's so understandable that you would not want to get off of your iPad. When I'm talking to my girlfriend and it's time for me to go cook dinner, I don't want to get off the phone to go cook dinner. I totally understand. You're in the middle of your game. You don't want to get off your iPad. Of course. How can we make this work for both of us? Do you feel the tone in that is so different than a punitive boundary, a punitive energy, right? You can ask yourself, what can I do to shift the energy? What can I do to shift the patterns? What can I do to shift the behaviors? You can ask, what can I bring in that will be most helpful in this situation? You can ask, how can I bring in ideas rather than complaints? How can I bring in solutions rather than repeating myself? How can I bring in a lighter tone rather than a heavy tone? How can I bring in an inviting tone rather than a constrictive tone? How can I bring in compassion for the other person's experience? How can I bring in compassion rather than judgment? How can I bring in spaciousness rather than judgment? How can I bring in an energy of cooperation, of possibilities, of opportunities? How can I bring in an energy of abundance rather than lack? And how can I take care of myself to ensure that this occurs? How can I take care of myself to ensure that this occurs? One thing that I can tell you guys unequivocally is that when you start listening to your own inner promptings, if you think of your own inner promptings on a scale of 1 to 10, if you start listening to your own inner promptings when they're at a 1, 2, 3, or 4, rather than a 7, 8, 9, 10, most of us wait until we're already aggravated, until we're already upset. And then it's very challenging to honestly and transparently bring in an energy of wanting cooperation and deeper intimacy. By the time you're at a 7, 8, 9, 10, you're already upset. And so you're going to bring in the energy of conflict because you have inner conflict because you didn't listen to your own inner promptings earlier on. So begin to express your need for boundaries earlier. Effective boundaries reflect our value system. So take the time to truly discern your values. Boundaries that reflect our values are more effective than boundaries that seek to impose control and impose compliance. So I'm going to say that again. Take the time to truly discern your values because boundaries that reflect your values are more effective than boundaries that seek to impose power, control, and compliance. What do I mean by that? If I value my son's safety, then when I impose a 10 p.m. curfew, that 10 p.m. curfew is very aligned with my value that says I want him to be safe at night. Not much happens. That's good after 11 p.m. at night. So when I impose a boundary around 10 p.m., when it reflects my value system, I feel good about imposing that 10 p.m. boundary because it reflects my value of safety rather than seeking to impose compliance from him. And in the midst of creating that boundary, I can ask, how can we make this work for both of us? What is it that you need from me? There are so many questions, as I referred to earlier, that you can ask so that you can talk, so that you can create more conversations of connection and intimacy that will have both parties feel really good about the boundaries. The more internally clear you are before you set the boundary, the less triggered you're going to be with the other person's reaction to your boundary. It's less about whether or not you set the boundary and more about your delivery of the boundary. So I'm going to say that one again. It's less about whether or not you actually set the boundary and more about your delivery of the boundary. When setting a boundary, you want to create the space for the other individual to have their reaction, because the more space there is for the other person's reaction, the less conflict you are going to create. The more you allow a conversation to occur as the result of setting a boundary, the less conflict will occur. So think about that. The more you invite a conversation, the less you will invite conflict. The more you invite collaboration, cooperation, the less you will invite conflict. And that has to do with the energy that you come into the situation with, right? The more your intention is to connect with the other, the less it will be about compliance. The more cooperation you will then engender. When you invest 90% of your energy into your own inner work before you set the boundary, the more that you will ultimately create connection, cooperation, collaboration, connection, intimacy. So lastly, I would love to leave you all with a few affirmations that you can try on this week around setting your boundaries. So here's one. I deserve respect and positivity in my relationships. Respect in my relationships begins with respect within myself. Respect within my relationships begins with respect within myself. So I deserve respect and positivity in my relationships. Saying no when I mean no is saying yes to my self-respect. So I'll say that one again. Saying no when I mean no is saying yes to my self-respect. Saying no to toxic behaviors is saying yes to my own self-growth and self-care. Setting effective boundaries cultivates inner self-respect. I release any guilt where setting boundaries is concerned because I love and respect myself. When I set clear boundaries, I am creating a safe space where I can thrive and attract positive energy into my life. As you can tell, the practice of setting effective boundaries will cultivate inner self-respect. And the more self-respect we have, the more self-confidence we will have in setting these effective boundaries. So lastly, just to tie it all together, what I hope you're leaving with is that the ultimate purpose of setting boundaries is to bring more positivity into your life. The ultimate purpose of setting effective boundaries in the first place isn't about boundaries to separate. It's about boundaries to engender cooperation, collaboration, conscious conversations, and connections. I set boundaries so that I can create closeness with another person, not distance. So just to review, we want to begin by asking ourselves, what were we taught from our family of origin around boundaries? What is our own style of setting boundaries? Are we passive aggressive? Do we bring in resentments and frustrations? How can we begin to give ourselves permission to set effective boundaries? And then you ask those questions around cooperation, collaboration, conscious conversations, creating spaciousness for the other person's reactions, and allowing everyone to feel seen, heard, and valued in the process, especially yourself. I want to share lastly that for a deeper dive into this conversation about boundaries, if it's something that you grapple with, I have a self-paced online course, and it's called From Conflict to Connection. From Conflict to Connection. The link is in the show notes below, and it is one of the most effective courses. I think it's about 6-8 hours worth of information, practices, guided meditations, guided processes that I guarantee will take you from a place of dis-ease, unease with setting boundaries to really creating intimacy, connection, collaboration, and conscious relationships, conscious connections in your life. So please, I hope that this is an episode you will go back to often, that you will practice some of these skills often, and just watch yourself create deeper intimacy with all the relationships in your life. And if this episode has been helpful to you, has been valuable to you, I would just so appreciate it if you would share it with someone, if you would subscribe, and if you would write a 5-star review. You have no idea how much the subscription so that you get alerted and the 5-star review helps to get this message out to more individuals. And when we have more thriving individuals on planet Earth, we have a healthier planet Earth. So much love, everyone. I'm so grateful, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much for listening. If there was something in this conversation that spoke to you, we'd so appreciate it if you would take the time to subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and share this episode with women and mothers you know, because you are here to thrive. See you next time.